You should get an alert. You should get an alert right about now. Okay, so right now it's going to be recorded, and this talk will be available for later viewing on the Epilepsy Foundation of Hawaii YouTube channel. I'll start out by introducing myself. I'm Naomi Manuel, and I'm with the Epilepsy Foundation of Hawaii. This foundation's mission is to lead the fight to overcome the challenges of living with epilepsy and to accelerate therapies, find cures, and save lives. We provide education, advocacy, referrals, and support for individuals and their caregivers impacted by seizures. So we really want to thank everyone for joining us. We especially want to thank our EFH very own board member, Erik Abe, for taking the time out of his busy schedule to talk story with us tonight about Hawaii's legislative process and the power of legislative advocacy. He has his slides already up. So I'm just going to go over a few housekeeping items. Please make sure that you're on mute so that it doesn't disrupt the speaker. Feel free to be on camera or not. It's completely up to you. I'll be monitoring the chat box, so please feel free also to utilize the chat function and ask any questions you may have. It's up to Erik to take a break whenever he feels like it, to do a check-in, and I'm sure you'll be watching for any questions that come in through the chat as well. Again, this talk is being recorded and will be available for future viewing on the EFH YouTube channel. So with that said, I would like to officially introduce Erik Abe. Since 1990, Erik has been involved with politics, advocacy, and government in the state of Hawaii. He holds a unique distinction for having served in a staff capacity with the House Finance, Judiciary, Consumer Protection and Commerce, and Labor Committees as a bill researcher, committee clerk, or analyst. A former researcher for the House Majority Staff Office, Abe later served as the Capital Improvement Project Specialist for the House Finance Committee, Special Assistant to the Majority Leader, and the Executive Director of Citizens for Responsive Government, also known as the House PAC, which was established to help House incumbents retain their offices. Erik Abe also worked as the Deputy Director of Government Affairs for the Chamber of Commerce of Hawaii. He currently is the Public Affairs and Policy Director of the Hawaii Primary Care Association and serves as a member of the Board of Directors of the Epilepsy Foundation of Hawaii. So again, thank you, Erik. We totally appreciate you, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. This event is a collaborative effort by the Hawaii Primary Care Association, the Epilepsy Foundation of Hawaii, and the American Cancer Society of Hawaii to foster a common understanding of advocacy in Hawaii. I want to thank Epilepsy Foundation of Hawaii's Executive Director, Naomi Manuel, and the American Cancer Society of Hawaii's Government Relations Director, Cynthia Au, for organizing this event and permitting me the opportunity to share my views with you. We're supposed to have a pretty diverse group here tonight. Some of you are volunteers or persons who have never participated in government before, but who are interested in getting involved. There are also others who have many years of experience as either a legislator, a lobbyist, or an advocate. There is one thing that everyone should have in common, is that we all believe that we can make a difference. And so keeping that in mind, this workshop is going to be a little bit different from what other groups might put forth. I'm going to focus more about mindsets and kind of describe to you what I usually do before each new legislative session. And so just to start off, this is actually the fourth workshop on advocacy that the Epilepsy Foundation has put forth. The first three actually go into really the nuts and bolts of how a bill becomes law, the different committee structures that the legislature utilizes, as well as how people get elected. And all of these have impacts on the decisions that lawmakers make. And so for all of these presentations, the slide decks are going to be made available for anyone to use as a reference. Before going further, though, I just want to point out that the views that are expressed in this presentation and all of these presentations should be viewed as solely my own and should not be construed as the official position of the Hawaii Primary Care Association, the Epilepsy Foundation of Hawaii, or the American Cancer Society of Hawaii. I'm going to throw out a question to everybody. Are we better off today than we were before? It's a pretty simple question, but I think for anyone who wants to get involved in advocacy, this is a question that you really should be asking yourself every day, because if at any time you say, yeah, we are better off today than we were before, there really isn't a need to advocate. You're basically, in your mind, you're thinking that everything is peachy and that we don't really need to make any kind of adjustments to society or to government or to anything. But the fact that you're here tonight would seem to suggest that, no, things are not better off today than they were before. And we're trying to look for different ways to make things better. So if you ask this question to the majority of people in the state, they probably say, yeah, things are not okay. All you have to do is just COVID-19. Just see everybody outside walking around with masks. You know that things are very different from what they were just a couple of years ago. I bring this up because I asked myself the same question, and I asked myself this question before every legislative session. And I try to think, okay, what is actually going on in the state? What is the main problems that everybody is facing? And what I try to do is I try to learn more about what is truly happening in the state. And by doing that, you'll get a better understanding of not only how to go about trying to make change, but also to try to figure out what really is at the root of the different problems. And so, given the fact that COVID is on the mind of everybody, I told myself, well, basically, COVID is impacting the economy. And it's really the economy that is causing a lot of the problems that we're all facing today. And so I asked myself, okay, what is the state of the economy? And so over the past month, I've done a lot of research. A lot of it has been on my own, it's been basically just reviewing public records to try to get a sense of what is really happening today. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share with you what I found and suggest to you that to a certain extent, anybody who is interested in advocacy, they need to actually try to find out what is really happening in the world that's affecting them. And so before I begin with what I found, there's just some things that I want to just point out. First, the Constitution requires the governor to submit a budget and a 6-year financial plan to the legislature each year. That's in law. The main reason why it's in law is to make sure that when the governor does put forth his budget and 6-year plan, that it's done publicly so that everyone can see what the governor believes to be the situation with the economy. The budget and financial plan are based on the revenue projections derived by the Council on Revenues. That too is also, it's clearly set in law. The Council of Revenues consists of the top economists from the biggest banks in the state, the University of Hawaii, the Departments of Budget, Economic Development and Tourism, Budget and Finance, and Taxation. That too is also, it's all set in law. And this think tank is actually made up of some of the smartest people that you could ever meet. They meet regularly, but are required to report their findings every January, March, May, and September of each year. Now, just to keep in mind, when the Council on Revenues comes out with projections, these projections are extremely conservative. And it's done so to ensure that the state will always collect more in revenues than what is projected. And that's also to meet a requirement in law that the legislature cannot appropriate more funds than they actually collect. And just as a general rule of thumb, for each percentage point of growth, it translates to approximately $80 million that's going to be going into the general fund. So with that said, let's take a look at some of these numbers. Now, what we have before you on this spreadsheet are the projections that came out from the Council on Revenues going back a couple of years. It comes out in this standard format with, you have the most current fiscal year and then 6 years that follow it. Each one of these percentage points equates to $80 million in general funds. And so when they were talking about a 4.7% increase or going out through all of these years, the Council of Revenues was basically saying that each year the state would actually collect about $320 million more than the preceding fiscal year. That kind of growth is pretty robust growth. And these kinds of numbers basically followed over the past maybe 5 years before this point, and things were so good in 2019 that for the first time in history, the state of Hawaii welcomed 10 million visitors in a single year, okay? Because of all of these surpluses, the state had actually accrued a general fund cash carryover balance of $829 million. So that means if they didn't collect one additional dollar in the in the general fund of the Treasury, you'd have close to $1 billion that's just sitting there, okay? Now, these numbers pretty much are reflective of what happened over the previous 5 years. There was only a slight adjustment predicted in September for the out years, for fiscal years 21 and 22. But what this basically means is they thought at the time that the economy would still be growing, but maybe just not as well as the previous years. And then when they did come out with their May projections, they seemed to think that this slowdown would occur starting in fiscal year 2022. These numbers seem to suggest that Hawaii's economy was kind of like a sports car. It's like a finely tuned machine, that was just built to collect money. And the state was collecting a lot of money leading up to COVID. And so just kind of keep that image in your mind of this Ferrari. But then COVID hit. And so starting on March 6, 2020, Hawaii reported its first case of COVID. Okay, that was just 1 week before the Council on Revenues came out with its March 13th report. And it had a huge impact on what they were going to report. Council of Revenues came out and it basically said they have no experience about what's happening, and what might happen to the economy. All they could say was they expect things to be pretty bad. And so they warned the legislature and the governor that they better start taking steps to try to protect the health and welfare of our citizens from this approaching disaster. Now, some of the things that occurred around this time, shortly after Council of Revenues reported these numbers, on March 23rd, the city and county of Honolulu issued its first stay-at-home order. 2 days after that, the state of Hawaii issued its stay-at-home order. And at that same time, they also implemented a mandatory 14-day quarantine for all travelers. This had the effect of basically shutting down our tourism industry. People stopped traveling when that happened. People were told they had to just stay at home. A lot of people lost their jobs. Hawaii went from having the lowest unemployment in the United States of 3% to the highest within a matter of months. The highest 25%, or 1 out of every 4 persons of workable age are basically out of work. Now, these developments had huge ramifications on the next set of projections. If you notice, in May of 2020, Council on Revenues changed their projections from a +3 to a -7. That's a swing of 10 percentage points. So again, each percentage points is $80 million. They're saying that the state is expected to make $800 million less in general funds for fiscal year 2020. And they figured it's going to be even worse for fiscal year 21. Okay. The shortfall that they were looking at was going to be over $1 billion. But as mentioned earlier, these projections are always ultra conservative. And so when they actually reported out how much was collected for fiscal year 2020, the state actually collected about $300 million more than what they had projected in May. Okay, it's just something to keep in mind. And again, I apologize that these are a lot of numbers, and for most people, this stuff it's like Greek. I get it. It's like that for me too, but there's a point to it. Now, basically, that Maserati was speeding down the freeway, was bringing in a whole lot of money, and then all of a sudden COVID hit. So it was as if this Maserati found itself having to traverse this rickety old bridge, and they have to go very slowly. They have to proceed very cautiously, or else, they're going to fall off the bridge and it's going to be catastrophic. That's basically what happened when COVID hit. So what did the legislature and the governor do? Well, starting in 2020, they eliminated hundreds of unfilled positions and implemented a hiring freeze. They suspended payments for other post-employment benefits, namely, the pensions of government employees. They started to receive huge infusions of federal funding to supplant various general fund liabilities. And this helped in that first year. But in 2021, the legislature took it a couple of more steps. They consolidated a lot of programs in the rated special funds, and this had a huge traumatic impacts on a lot of social service organizations, including the Hawaii Primary Care Association. Basically, everything was put onto the table, and lawmakers were looking to slash programs in order to meet what they thought were going to be huge budget shortfalls. The other thing too that they did, they transferred the county's share of the transient accommodations tax to the general fund. And lastly, the governor appointed a new tax director who is aggressively collecting tax revenues. In particular, he's going after, internet sales, to try to get those types of transactions taxed in the state. Now, for each one of these points, it basically translates to hundreds of millions of dollars of new monies going into the general fund. And so, if just one of these things occurred, it would have a big impact. But what is the impact when all of these things happened at the same time? Let's take a look at the numbers. Well, before we do that, going back to the analogy, basically what the legislature and the governor did was they took that Maserati and they stripped off all of the dead weight. They also supercharged the engine. They put in special fuel into it to just supercharge the economy, so that if you thought Hawaii's economy could collect tax revenues before COVID, wait till you see it now. So what happened? So starting in 2020, okay, right around this time in September, the governor and the mayors, they lifted the stay-at-home orders. And so all of a sudden, people started going back to work. At that same time, the governor, he changed the restrictions on inter-island travel and eased some of the restrictions that had been placed on interstate travel. And so Council of Revenues figured, okay, this is going to actually lead to more in revenue collections. And so that particular projected rate went down from a negative 12% to a negative 11%, meaning that Council of Revenues figured that the state would probably collect about another $80 million, okay? But by the time they got up to the legislative session of 2021, they saw that the economy was actually improving so much that they revised their projections by 4.5 points. So that means they're figuring the state is going to collect about 300 million more than what they had previously thought. Then it came down to March. The March projection was really important because this is what the legislature used when they actually came to agreement on the budget. So much so that they used these numbers that the managers of the conference committee put these exact numbers into the conference committee report. They wanted to make very clear that they were basing all of their decisions on the budget on this set of numbers. And by this time, Council of Revenues had upgraded the state for fiscal year 2021 by another 4 percentage points. So that means they're figuring the state is going to collect another $320 million in general funds, okay? Now, keep in mind, while this was going on, the legislature slashed the budget. And basically, at this point, most social service organizations, they were reeling. Already they were told they're not going to be getting any grant and aid at this time. Many programs, were eliminated, leading to layoffs because of it. When the legislature convened, one of the things they did do too was they passed out a revision to the transient accommodations tax. And I mentioned that earlier. By eliminating the county share of the transient accommodations tax, it led to a huge infusion of funds to the general fund. And so by the time he got to May, Council of Revenue's projections went from a minus 2.5 to a positive 5. That's a 7.5 percentage point swing. 7 times 8, 56. So we're talking, they're expecting the state to collect an extra $560 million from what numbers they thought the state was going to collect when they actually came to decision on the budget. And as mentioned before, these projections are always ultra conservative. And so when they actually looked at how much monies were collected, they found that the state had collected about $250 million more than what they had previously projected. So this 5% growth was actually more like a 7% growth. So take a look at these numbers, okay? The legislature going into the 2021 regular session, they were looking at the state collecting about $6.2 billion in general funds. But in actuality, for that fiscal year, they collected about $1 billion more. If you compare it to the time that the numbers that they used when they actually put the budget to bed, it's about $700 million more than what they thought they were going to have for that year. When you take a look at the out years, right, basically these numbers are just as big. At the time that the budget was approved, they were looking at the state collecting $6.7 billion for fiscal year 2022. But in actuality, well, what the revised projections seem to indicate, the state is going to collect about another $1 billion. So based on this, it would seem as though the state is collecting a lot of money. It's collecting a whole lot of money, and our treasury is getting packed full of cash. Let's take a look at these numbers pre-COVID to what they look like today. Now, as mentioned earlier, 4% growth is very robust growth. And that's basically what the state experienced in the 5 years leading up to COVID. But take a look at these numbers to what the most recent report says. If you notice, these numbers actually look a whole lot better than what they did before COVID hit. So what does this mean, right? The state seems to be collecting a whole lot of money. But wait, there's more. Now, just a couple of weeks ago, there was an article that appeared in the Star Advertiser. It was sort of buried in the Hawaii section. And it basically said Hawaii sells $1.9 billion in taxable general obligation bonds. Now, if you ask most people, they probably couldn't tell you what a general obligation bond is, but it is a financing mechanism that governments use to pay for construction. And if you look back historically, usually the state will only sell maybe around 500 million to 800 million in a year, in a single year. But this year, they sold nearly twice that amount. Well, why is this important? Okay. It's like a loan. The state is actually borrowing $1.9 million. They're going to be paying 6% interest on this $2 billion. So starting from next year, the state is going to have to pay about $120 million just to pay off the debt service on these bonds, okay, over the next 20 years. You have to ask yourself, though, what are they going to be able to spend all of this money in 1 year? Now, that's a question that's kind of difficult to answer, but it has been answered. And keeping in mind that Hawaii is a relatively small place, if every construction worker in the state of Hawaii worked on state projects, the most money that the state could actually spend in a single year on construction is probably going to be about $1 billion. Then when you keep in mind that the city is also putting forth the rail project, you have a lot of construction workers working that project, the amount that can actually be spent on state projects is going to be even less than that. But yet the state took out all this money and it's going to be sitting in the bond fund. It's going to be sitting as cash in the state treasury. Now, why is that? Now, it could be that because of what had occurred with COVID, the new reality is for state government, they're going to have to hold more monies in reserve to deal with situations as they arise. And so this could be an indication of how things are going to happen moving forward. And so that's something to keep in mind. So to summarize, what did I find? The state of Hawaii collected about $1 billion more than what was projected for fiscal year 2021 by the Council on Revenues in January of 2021. The state is currently expected to collect about $500 million more than what was previously projected by the Council of Revenues in May of 2021 for fiscal years 2022 and 23 respectively. Each year, they'll probably collect about $500 million more. And then approximately $1 billion from the sale of general obligation bonds are going to sit in the treasury to help keep the state finances liquid. Now, this also seems to suggest that Hawaii's economy is extremely fragile. I mean, all it could take is another variant to hit our islands. 500 people flood our intensive care beds, and the governor is going to have to shut everything down again. And when that happens, everything, all tax collections, the spigot gets turned off. It also shows that Hawaii's economy is an incredibly effective mechanism for collecting revenues. And again, using that analogy of the car, it's like driving that Ferrari down a rickety bridge. At any time, everything could just slow down. So I thought to myself, there's a lot of things here that are sort of counterintuitive. I mean, all you have to do is just read the newspaper. The governor announces that, he's telling everybody not to come to the state of Hawaii. You just ask your neighbors, have you been going out? Nah, I've been pretty much staying at home. I don't really even go out to eat. All these kinds of things seems to suggest that the economy is really not in a good shape. And so why is it that they're collecting so much money? So I talked to some people who have a lot of experience in government, people who have experience with the budget, and with taxes. And basically, they suggested two things. Right before COVID hit, the legislature had raised the transient accommodations tax to the highest level it's ever been. And basically, because of that higher rate, even though fewer visitors have come into our state, they've been paying more. And so that has helped to offset the losses in revenue from fewer visitors coming into the state. The other thing is, I was told that the number of transactions that are occurring in the marketplace are actually down by a lot. But if transactions are down and we're still collecting more money than expected, that would seem to suggest that we're being hit with inflation. Everything is costing more now. And all you have to do is just take a look at the next time you buy food, what your food bill is going to be, or filling gas. Everybody is paying more. And because we have a general excise tax, the more you pay for these essential goods, the more monies are going to be collected and deposited into the general fund. And again, this is an exercise that I usually do before the legislative session starts. It's just that because of what occurred with COVID, the focus has been much more on the economy than I've done in previous years. And of course, I'm not suggesting that everybody is going to have to do the same thing that I did. But what I'm suggesting is that anybody who is interested in advocating needs to take a look at what is happening in their world. What is actually happening that is causing the problem that you want to address? And you need to actually sort of immerse yourself into it to get a really clear picture of what is happening. Now, based on all of this, in all likelihood, lawmakers are going to continue to say that the state has no money, and they're going to try to lower public expectations. And there's good reason for it, because if at any time a new variant of COVID comes to the state, we might have to shut everything down. And so all those monies that they're collecting into the treasury, they're going to need that flexibility in order to deal with the emergency needs. It also appears too that social service providers, they're still traumatized from what occurred in 2021. Some of my peer organizations have indicated, they're not going to even ask for appropriation bills this coming year. And instead of hoping for grant and aid, they're actually looking at maybe the city council or the county councils to perhaps provide some grant and aid or some resources to help their organizations. I just bring all of this to your attention to just state that in order to advocate effectively, you need to have situational awareness. You need to be aware of what is happening. If you don't really have a clear understanding of what is really going on, it's going to be really difficult to figure out how to address a problem. And everything is holistic. I work for the Hawaii Primary Care Association. Our interests are mostly dealing with health issues. The Epilepsy Foundation, they're even more narrow. They're looking at only epilepsy. American Cancer Society, they're only looking at cancer. But yet, what the legislature does pertaining to the transient accommodations tax is going to have an enormous ramification on whether or not the state can actually fund programs dealing with cancer or epilepsy or federally qualified health centers. And so that's why it's really important to have that kind of an understanding across the board. Now, I'm not an economist, you know. People ask me, what is my specialty? I don't really have a specialty. When I basically tell people, I'm basically a generalist. I know a little bit about a lot of different things. I know the process. I understand where to get information. But in a lot of ways, I'm no different from you or anybody else. And so, if someone told me, go take a look at the Council on Revenue's, quarterly reports, without actually doing a little bit of digging and finding out what the Council of Revenue is, I probably would think you're nuts. But yet, all of this is part of the public record. It's put into law, and it's put into law specifically to give the public all of these tools in order to find out more about what is happening. And you need to be able to use those tools to be able to find out for yourselves whether or not the prevailing narrative that you're hearing from everybody else is correct. Is it truly the case that the state doesn't have money? Arguably, that's not correct. If the state does have this amount of money in the treasury, couldn't that be funds that could be used to shore up the social safety net? Could it be used to develop new programs for economic development for all of these other worthwhile purposes? Of course. But yet, too, if they're going to keep it in the budget or in the state treasury, there must be a reason. And yeah, if there is going to be, anywhere from a 3-month to a 4-month lag, in the best case scenarios for the state of Hawaii to receive federal aid in the event that there is a turn or a new variant of COVID hitting, the state is going to have to figure out how they're going to deal with the day-to-day needs of the citizenry, until then. So these are all things that everyone really needs to be aware of and to actually take into consideration when they try to figure out how best to advocate. We all need to be willing to ask questions, no matter how basic or how complex they are, and hold our elected officials accountable. That's their job. And yeah, it might not be pleasant. It might not be the local way, not making another person look bad or whatnot. It doesn't have to be done in a way to make someone look bad, but our elected officials, they're there to do a job, and we need to make sure that they do their job. And so with that said, I open up the discussion to questions. I know this was a lot of information, and for many of you who are new to advocacy, a lot of this might have been like Greek, and for that I apologize. But again, my main message is advocacy is very difficult, and people need to be willing to actually find out for themselves what is happening. And only then can they try to figure out what is the best course of action to take.
So Eric, I have a question that someone sent a direct chat question to me.
Okay.
So I typed it into the chat box. So I'll put it to everyone, and it says, the budget is very important to know about, but how do we get started with a cause that we're passionate about? Where do we go? Who do we ask? How do we ask?
That's a really good question. And I think the best way of answering it at the very start is being willing to talk to others, Start off with your family and your friends. Point out, an idea and see what they think about it. And then if more people agree with that idea, and after maybe doing a little more digging to find out more information about the issue, you share that with more people. You might be able to find other organizations that have done similar things, and you can reach out to them to get involved. But it all starts off with being willing to actually talk to the people who you are most comfortable with, the people who you trust the most, to share with them how you truly feel about government, about society, about things that are happening. We're really fortunate to have, a former legislator on board in our audience. Her name is Bev Harbin. She was a former legislator from Kaka'ako. I've worked with her extensively over the past couple of years in developing the various strategies used on behalf of advocating for the Hawaii Primary Care Association. Ms. Harbin is the executive director of Waihoa Community Health Center. Bev, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Eric.
Do you have any thoughts or things that you might like to share?
Well, what I'd like to share is, I look at all your faces, and the faces I can see show me that you're all young people that have a passion for a certain cause or a certain what you consider a social injustice. I'm born and raised in Oahu, and it seems like I was born into always finding some type of a social injustice that really upsets me in different ways within our communities, especially all of Hawaii, but especially on Oahu. So the thing is, there are so many competing social justice, passionate things that many of us believe in. Younger in my life, I was a rabid board member of the Outdoor Circle, running around saving trees. And then I became a very rabid League of Women Voters board meeting back in my 20s with the ERA. Some of you don't even know what the ERA is, but the Equal Rights Amendment for women's rights. So I've always been involved in some kind of injustice that I really care about. But I always know that there's thousands of others in the islands that have the same passion for their particular concern. Nonprofits is one of the biggest employers in the state of Hawaii. All the work that our state government we pay taxes for is supposed to be doing the work to take care of the vulnerable, the underprivileged, the people that you represent, the people that I represent now in our Wahiawa area. But what they do is they take the tax dollars and they pass it off to nonprofits and say, here, you're better at this. You go do it and we'll support you. But then you become very dependent on state funding. And there's thousands of other organizations that are there begging for the same dollars that you want to get. I compete with like 3 other nonprofits that do great work in Wahiawa, and I have to compete with them for the same dollars. So I think my message to you is always keep your passion burning, but know that going for state dollars or even city dollars is a difficult thing to do, because it can kind of kill your passion because it's so hard to do, but it's very doable. What Eric was showing you is how much money comes into our state coffers, but you've got those legislators and those city people that have their favorite programs or have the people that really catch their eye that they will figure out a way to get some funds to you. This upcoming legislative session is going to be bad because I have been told there will be no grants and aid. So how are they going to help all of us? I don't know that answer. I don't think Erik really does. I think what he was trying to share is we're not as broke as we think we are, but we're in a lot of trouble. And I would like to encourage you guys to just stay the course and learn the ways of getting to your legislative representatives. Each one of you have people in the legislature that you can personally call and get your fellow nonprofit members in front of them, because that's what it takes. It takes consistent, what Erik calls advocacy, but I call it aggressive, hardball politics, because we who serve the people we need, that need our help, are the ones that are not really supported, and we have to fight for every dollar. So, get your punching gloves on, get ready to fight. The one that makes the biggest noise and presents your, commitment are the ones that are going to get something. And once you get in those corridors and you get in there and you get the attention of key legislators, you will always be able to come back for more and to continue your good work. That's, I don't mean it to sound negative, but it's hard work. But I'm going to tell you something. At the end of session, if you've got some kind of funding, it is such a rewarding feeling to be able to share that with your people.
Thank you, Bev. Naomi?
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you and then just go back to the chat if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
We have another question. Shout out, great presentation. The question is, who decides how much general obligation bonds to sell and on what kind of timeline? And it's alarming to learn about the huge jump and wondering if that's going to cause problems for state liabilities in the future.
Well, the legislature authorizes the governor to sell a certain amount of general obligation bonds. This is based on the different capital improvement projects that are approved in the budget. So you need to keep in mind, what exactly is a budget? Basically, all it is the legislative authority for the governor to spend up to a certain amount. And so what happens is every year there's going to be maybe 100 different projects that are listed in the budget. And they're going to authorize all of these amounts of general obligation bonds in order to actually do construction on all of these projects. But from a practical standpoint, you cannot actually begin work on all of these projects all at the same time. And so what government will do is they'll actually figure out which projects they want to fast track, which ones they may not necessarily agree with, but they'll let it go through. And there are going to be some projects that they just disagree with the legislature in what they put into the budget. And so in order to fund these various projects, each year the governor will go to bond council, take a look at the budget act, see how much in general obligation bonds they can actually sell, and just sell the amount of general obligation bonds that they will need to facilitate those projects that the governor decides they want to construct. That way, you're not going to be run into a situation of actually selling more general obligation bonds than you really have to, considering that you can only spend up to $1 billion in a single year. It usually, it takes 20 years for this obligation to be fulfilled. So as I mentioned, for every $100 million in general obligation bonds sold, the state is going to have to pay $6 million in general funds each year for the next 20 years in order to pay down that debt. And so that's just how it works. And so that's why the budget itself as a document, it's not like there's somebody who is going to be there who is actually going to be passing out dollars based on whatever is listed in that bill. It just gives the governor the ability to spend up to that amount for all of those different line items for all of the different purposes that government provides for. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
I think that's a good answer. And in the essence of time, can we go to this last question real quickly? So the question is, how can we take the multiple nonprofit fundings of X amount of dollars for Y and join them together? So join nonprofits of similar fields, like the Epilepsy Foundation, Hawaii PCA, Cancer Society, and so forth, to share funds, and in doing so, join those nonprofits together in a united front, so to speak.
well, arguably, that's how it's supposed to be already. If anything, the legislature created the Hawaii Community Foundation that was intended to serve as a clearinghouse for all of the nonprofits. And they were supposed to have a certain amount of fiscal flexibility in how state funds would be divvied up among the various nonprofits. But even the Hawaii Community Foundation ran into a lot of issues this past year when the legislature looked to eliminate dedicated funding from the Tobacco Settlement Trust Fund that goes every year specifically for that purpose. And so, the COVID situation created havoc. It forced lawmakers to reevaluate everything. And in doing so, it's going to take some time for social service organizations to actually figure out how to handle themselves under this new normal. But one of the things that we all need to keep into consideration, hey, people are still suffering. All you have to do is just take a look at, you walk around. I'm currently in downtown. I'm in my office on Bishop Street. And shortly after this presentation, I'm going to have to walk home. My condo is about 2 blocks away. Okay. In the process of walking the 2 blocks home, I'm going to probably come across maybe 2 or 3 homeless people who sleep on Bishop Street. And you know what? The number of people who are actually turning up on the street each night has been going up. There's more and more people out there. And considering that the state, did away with the moratorium on evictions, at some point, the landowners are going to want their rent, all the rent that tenants have been delinquent in paying when they lost their jobs during COVID. And what's going to happen then? At some point, people, they're suffering. And we need to actually ask ourselves, is government doing everything that it can to try to improve the situation? As advocates, I think we have a responsibility to try to find out what are all the things that government can do to help these people. And then we have to ask ourselves, if they're not doing everything that they can, why is that? That's a pretty radical message. And I have to admit, when I was talking with Cynthia and Naomi about what I was going to say tonight, I was a little bit nervous, but I think it's an important message. And especially to people who are just starting out, wanting to get involved. I think it's an important message to hear. People need to actually go out, take a look at what is happening, and maybe do some digging, try to find out more about what is going on. And then you have to ask yourself, what can I do to improve the situation? We're really fortunate. We have a couple of longtime lobbyists here. I see Don Wiseman is on board. Don, is there anything you'd like to share?
Well, I've been thinking a question for you is that, we have a unique state law that requires our businesses to cover a large percentage of the healthcare costs of their employees. So that puts them on the hook to have an interest in health in our state. And so, how do we motivate the businesses to also advocate for these health issues, since it affects their bottom line if they're successful in trying to improve health? Because if you improve health, you especially around prevention, you can definitely control the healthcare costs that they have to pay, which is one of their biggest bottom line costs. So I think that's something we should think about, is how do we engage our business leaders? Obviously, there's some who have special interests in some of these other areas, but there's a lot of businesses who don't have the special interest in, say, building, and I think would probably get behind some of these issues, these public health issues and social issues, because it will affect their bottom line down the road, and especially trying to compete globally. If they can control those healthcare costs that no other places have to worry about, it gives them a better chance to compete.
I think that's a very good question. And I have to admit, I'm going to be a little bit biased because, in a former life, at one point, I was the lobbyist for the Chamber of Commerce of Hawaii. At the same time, too, I was also the committee clerk for the House Labor Committee. And so I understand how the Prepaid Healthcare Act, how much of a battle, took place in order to get that legislation enacted. Be that as it may, I think the best way of answering your question, Don, is to just kind of look at it from the perspective of what is happening out there in the state right now. I think right now, the business community, more than any other sector, is hurting the most because of what is happening with COVID. If anything, they've had to lay off a lot of workers. They've had to cut down the number of hours. If anything, a lot of businesses right now, they're struggling just to survive. And so I think if things were normalized, I think if they had an opportunity, they really would want to improve the benefits that they can provide to their employees. If anything, that's going to make it easier for them to attract and retain good employees, which most businesses would be fighting for. They would want to keep. But right now, I think it's going to be really hard to ask any more of the business community, at least until such time as things stabilize a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it's the small businesses especially, which are the larger percentage of businesses that are hurting. But I think the big businesses are actually thriving because they're able to cut costs in other places through working from home and things like that. We've actually done very well as an organization in getting businesses to support some of our efforts, because we've shifted away from selling tables and tents and things like that at special events. And we're actually selling opportunities to support our efforts to help the community. So we did adopt a clinic, helping all the federally qualified health centers, and businesses were quick to jump on board for multi-year sponsorships to be part of that support network. So I think the big businesses are not hurting as bad as you think they are. The smaller businesses maybe.
Oh, that's a point. That's a good point. Maybe to kind of add to that, I see that Becky Gardner is on. Becky is a former staffer at the legislature. She's an attorney, formerly with the House Committee on Consumer Protection and Commerce. She's also, right now, she is a lobbyist, and she represents some new industries. And as I guess, a newer lobbyist in the field, maybe, you would, if you don't mind, maybe sharing some perspectives on that.
Hi, thanks, Eric. Sorry, I was just trying to figure out my screen so it doesn't look weird. I'm looking up in space. Eric, that was excellent. I always just felt that the budget is sort of like a smoke and mirrors game, and it's just real easy to like chuck it into this rationale of like, it's a money thing. You wouldn't understand little people. And I think this was just really empowering, just to, we're getting the wool pull over our eyes here. And it's just validating, because we have a sense of it, but just to see the actual numbers is helpful. Some of you might know my name. I ran for office in the Kaimuki, Pololo, St. Louis Heights area. The last election I lost. And in the process, I also had, with the pandemic, lost my state job. So Eric and I worked together when we were both at the Capitol. So I know a lot like about these like internal government things, but now I'm coming at it from the outside. I started my own lobby advocacy firm called Policy Matters LLC. And my clients currently are mental health professionals, National Association of Social Workers, Hawaii Psychological Association, and Marriage Family Therapists, the Hawaii chapter. And just talking with these guys and working with them, we've HUI'd up sort of as a mental health HUI, and we're sharing our experiences, working in the Capitol or with certain legislators. And, I hear this theme coming up over the course of this, where just like, oh, we'll talk to each other, work with together, band together. And I have to say that, like, I kind of went through that experience, as a newbie in business, as a lobbyist, and working with these organizations. And we're just feeling our way together, and we're growing, and we're like synergizing, I would say. And I see like the seeds of that happening here with some of these groups. I see some comments about like, how can we connect and how can we amplify our efforts? So, I was in a meeting with Senator Ocasio a couple of weeks ago, and she had said something about how she feels like there's a shift about to happen. And I think that this Zoom revolution and having all these hearings on YouTube, and I went there, I've stitched together different comments said in these hearings, and we put in a video like, look, this is how they pulled the wool over our eyes with the shell game. Like, this is ridiculous. So I think that the smarter we get, like events like this that Eric's putting on, the better we'll be able to take back our power and not be vulnerable to these kinds of ideas. Like, it's a budget thing, you wouldn't understand. So just thanks, Eric. And, I'll just, if anyone wants to reach out to me, I'm very interested in a lot of these causes that I see represented too. So yeah, thanks for letting me chat.
No, thank you, Becky. And, when we were putting this together, I immediately thought about you. If anything, because you're basically doing the same kinds of things that I'm doing at HPCA, what Cynthia is doing with the American Cancer Society, what Naomi is doing with the Epilepsy Foundation. If anything, sort of the message that I'm sharing is really different. Basically, I'm not telling anybody how they should, what they should do. All I'm suggesting is they need to actually find out more about what is happening so that they're able to make the best educated decision on behalf of their organizations or on behalf of, the people that they're advocating for. That's what I've always stressed in all the years that I've worked. That's how I was taught. And I think it's really important, And maybe Cynthia, you can kind of talk a little bit about that. If anything, Cynthia and I go back many years. You know, if anything, I've looked at her as I've kind of took her under my wing many years ago, back when she worked at the legislature. And if anything, we've worked together in a lot of different capacities, in a lot of different ways. I'm very grateful to the partnership that we've made with the American Cancer Society because of Cynthia. And so, Cynthia, any thoughts that you'd like to share?
First of all, what a wonderful presentation about the budget. I am still like learning from Erik and all his wisdom, and I'm so glad that he opened it up to so many organizations that I see here today. And I think it's so great. I just to, I guess, touch back on what following up on what Becky was talking about, how everything has now shifted. Now it's like this Zoom thing. This is also, made it more important for us as like healthcare advocates or whatever we're advocating for, to be able to work together, especially now, and especially if the legislature is really trying to pull the wool over our eyes, right? And looking at it from a different perspective and being able to, work together to really learn more from each other and the process. And I think this is so awesome. And I'm glad to see, familiar names here tonight. And yeah, I hope that, I don't know, like, please reach out. Like, if anybody who wants to work, and I remember the first question, which was like, how do we get involved? Like, please share my information out. I don't know, I'll put my information out there if anybody wants to help, or if you want to talk to me about what I have learned or know, with Erik, I'm here. So thank you, everybody.
And I guess lastly, I wanted to ask Naomi for some of her thoughts. If anything, this is relatively new. I've been trying to help Naomi develop the legislative program or the advocacy program on behalf of the Epilepsy Foundation. And so a lot of this is relatively new to her as well. And so I just wanted to hear what you think about what we were trying to do tonight.
I think I'm very fortunate to have you on my board to be able to help guide this process. I know you mentioned earlier that this is the fourth talk that Erik has done, but it's the first one done through Zoom. He's done this through Facebook Live, and he's done it in person pre-COVID, the first three, and it was literally the legislative process 101, who's who in government, how do you ask questions, where do you go, and what is the process from like a bill to here to here to here to here. So I'm fortunate enough to have that. I know a lot of people on this Zoom call today, that's right in your wheelhouse. It's what you do, it's what you've built your career on. And I've, at this point where I'm at now, I think I still have a lot to learn. And I'm, like I said, very grateful to Erik and to all of you here on this call. And I wanted to also say too, with sharing information, type it in the chat so that we all have it. For the Policy Matters LLC, put your information in there so that we can all kind of, know who we all are. Cynthia, put in your information for the Hawaii Cancer Society, just so we can kind of get, used to each other and network in the best way that we can. But in terms of this fourth presentation that Erik has done for us, it's just so powerful, and it's just next level for me. And I'm still learning, and I'm just so grateful for for all the information that you've shared, the guidance that you've given, and the perspective that you've given. Because I know I asked you earlier, can you just be a little more specific? You know, we have people on the call who don't really know, and your point was, my point is, we need to dive deeper ourselves. What are we trying to look for? What are we trying to advocate for? And dig around and poke around so that we aren't being told what to do or how to do it. You know, advocate for yourself and try to find out the process, you know, yourself and ourselves. And in that process, we will learn the process. And I think with Becky saying, you know, with this whole Zoom thing, we're all navigating this as well. You know, what is appropriate, what's not appropriate, which legislators are, you know, more tech savvy and not, and how do we take these legislative sessions, or not session, but committee meetings and things, how do we navigate that now without, you know, before we would have to go to the, we go down to the, not the courthouse, but the, down to the legislature, and we'd have to go and find the committee offices and meetings and all of that. It's just a whole new world that we're navigating. And I think that if we all, you know, keep in touch and be transparent and open, we can really bring together a huge wave of change that is beneficial to all the things that we're passionate about, whether it's cancer, epilepsy, or any general health, things like that. This is, yeah, that's my feedback. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you, Erik.
Well, you know, if anything, this was a learning experience for me as well, you know, and again, too, yeah, before every legislative session for I don't know how many years, I'd always just do a lot of, I'd be in deep thought. I'd be just kind of thinking about all the different things that I read or I hear in the news, or I hear people talking, they mention about, you know, different things that are going on. And I would think in my head, does this make sense? Does this sound right? And I would actually go and try to learn a little bit more about it, because what I found over these years is that everything is interrelated. And so what you may not think has no relation whatsoever with everything else, everything is interrelated, you know. And so it's important to have that kind of macro understanding or awareness of these different things, to really be in a position to actually decide whether or not you can get involved. And is there anything you really can do on an issue? And just going through that exercise in trying to figure out whether or not this can be done or can't be done, you can learn a lot just from that, you know. And so, you know, again, I really want to thank both Cynthia and Naomi for allowing me this opportunity to share the past couple of hours with you, you know, basically just sharing with you some of my deeper thoughts, you know, on what is happening today. And I'm not professing to be an expert in any way, shape, or form on any of this. For this presentation, I came up with no numbers on my own. All of this stuff, it's all public record. And it's all tools that are available to the public to actually find out, you know, or to keep track of what is happening, you know. And so that's just something to keep in mind. And
Hey, Erik,
yes.
hey, if I could add one other thing, you know, what brings me out, I've been doing this for 32 years for the Heart Association in Hawaii. So you'd think, yeah, he knows lots about everything, but the key, one of the biggest commodities at the Capitol is information. The more information you have about what's going on, the better you're positioned to maybe be able to manipulate things the way you want it to go. And so that's why I'm here. You pick up little nuggets everywhere. So, you know, if you can hear something new, it's worth being there. So, you know, interact as much as you can, because that information will come back to help you like Eric said, everything is intertwined some way or another, especially on an island state.
No, thanks a lot, Don. And I want to thank everyone here, for sharing some of your time with us. If anything, if you ever want to ask me a question, you can get in touch with me through Naomi or through Cynthia, through the Epilepsy Foundation, through the American Cancer Society. I work for the Hawaii Primary Care Association. And so that's another way too, you can get in touch with me. Whatever I can do to help you, I'd like to try.
Okay, I was just trying to type in I just realized I was not on mute. I was trying to type in my information. But I think we're rounding up at an hour and a half now. So if there isn't any other questions, I just want to, send out just a huge thank you to you, Eric, and then of course, Bev, Becky, Don, Cynthia, for the information that you shared today. I know we all appreciate it for sure at any level that we're at. And I want to thank everyone else too for sharing your evening with us and the great questions, the great comments, and discussion points and things to think about moving forward. And that's really the whole point of this presentation, is to think about advocacy beyond just the specifics. So with that said, I will have this slide deck available. I'll send it out to everyone who registered today, and then I'll have it available also on the website, if that's okay. With that said, I'm going to stop the recording, and